Just a few points from me before we throw open the floor. I think we are very fortunate that we have these three scientists who come here and are given their perspectives of what it is, particularly Professor Chandrashekhar's briefing, his presentation, and what the present day capabilities are. As a military man who's been in the Navy for 34 years, I understand the field requirements and complications thereof. He started off with the ISR requirements, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. In the Navy, in the other armed forces, we talk about C4ISR, command communications controls, and thereafter include the ISR. There are many I2SR, IS4R, all this gets added up, but it doesn't matter. The point is there is a basic requirement for you to have a surveillance capability. Come a long way from Pokhran, which was discussed here, and today you saw the constellations that are there. There is no escape for you. Whether it's 1 mile area or whether it's 10 mile area, you are under surveillance. But only thing is, with the kind of predictions that can be made, you can perhaps be using AI and other mechanisms and algorithms, maybe in a position to say if these constellations are this particular configuration, maybe they are in a position to now launch an attack, or they are preparing to test out the complete C4ISR mechanism by these constellations which are there, which is it is not a surprising fact that after 2-3 hours, 208 minutes, I think he showed in one of this, thereafter the probability is something like 88%, which is very high. So what is it that we need to know? One is the point that's been made clear, not only now, even at the earlier time when Professor Chandrashekar come here has made it very clear that we are lagging behind. We are not invested enough in our satellites. We are not invested in the ecosystem that support the entire gamut of satellite surveillance. Professor Ramani brought out the need on the INTEG. INTEG is basically, for those of you who do not know, it's the Indian Naval Tactical Evaluation Group, so which has been there for 50 years. I've been there, I worked there, and those days itself, I'm talking about 40 years ago, where they were using computers to look at simulations. Today, the kind of input that Professor Ramani is giving is something that's integrated into that to create a picture, from where you derive the probability. So this is mathematical. There is purely mathematical equations and a lot of computer dynamics go into this, algorithms go into it, and it's being refined continuously. A lot of money is invested. Dr. Ramani will know that in INTEG we put in a lot of money just to refine the systems that are there. There are huge screens in phenomenal rooms where we can play out a complete war game, where these are injected, the kind of satellites that they are using. Of these satellite constellations that we spoke about, it's not just one type of satellites. We are looking at very specific capable satellites which require SIGINT, ELINT, SAR capable ones, which he clearly brought out to say they can only look one side. So, the optimization of the resources that you have put in the skies, the eye in the sky as we call it, is something that adds to his potential. So, the Taiwan scene that was painted so well by Professor Chandrashekar told you that, they carried out this exercise, but who are they firing at? It was to convey a political signaling. It's not just about a SLT capability or a capability to launch a missile. It's more about signaling that was there, which came out because of Nancy Pelosi's visit. So they said, we are now ready to carry out attacks in these 7 areas. That was to say that we will keep you out of these areas which are of importance to us. So they also fired into the exclusive economic zone of Japan, into other Philippines. You saw those, the figures which are shown there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, which are showed you the kind of surveillance capability that they have. As I also said earlier in the remarks part, the fact that you are able to push the carrier force. The strength of America is the carrier battle group. The carrier battle group, which is fully commissioned, they have 11 nuclear powered carriers, and each of them propels something like 100,000 tons. And they carry 95 to 120 aircraft, all descriptions, AW aircraft, logistics support aircraft, fuelers, fighters, bombers, everything is there on that one floating city of the carrier. China is nowhere near this, nowhere. Let me repeat, they are trying to reach there. They have 3 carriers. As has come out in many of our discussions, none of these carriers have not even crossed the Malacca Straits. Why? Because that kind of a capability that America possesses is yet to be realized by, they're working towards it very hard. In fact, even just about 3-4 months ago that they started trying to integrate their AW aircraft, onboard AW aircraft. All these are Western copies. Of course, with Professor Ramurthy says, yes, they perhaps stopped things from 2000. I don't believe it. They continue to copy. They continue to have their people from PLA who are going to USA to get those secrets. And after this standoff which was there, they clearly said we are not allowing PLA people to come into our universities. No, because they were coming as academics from the PLA. So there's a big game that's going on. China will definitely match USA in terms of their surveillance capabilities, that there are no doubts whatsoever. Because the number of satellites that they are launching, the kind of systematic planning in keeping areas of importance under surveillance, whether it's the Indo-Pacific area or the Indian Ocean region, all this is extremely well integrated. There's one slide Professor Chandru showed, which had the DF-21 kind of an ASBM, which was in the center. And you saw the network of what all was going into the information feed system, which enabled you to fire a DF-21 or whatever, or an advanced version to the carrier fleet. It also came out in the discussions that, the carrier, since it moves 300 nautical miles every day, you can't pinpoint it. And also there are many countermeasures that both America and India have looked at. It's not that just because DF-21 is fired, a carrier is sunk. It will not happen like that. So don't be under the impression just because they have the capability to fly at 10 DF-21s, one carrier is sunk. It's not going to be like that. Why did they prove the concept of 2007 ASAT capability? Why? Because they know you have to gouge the eye of your adversary. You blind him. After that, where does he control it? The same thing that the America follows. So you think they don't have counters? So if already one DF-21 has been, you are at war. And the next stage, believe you me, will be shooting down of satellites. It will happen. So, it's not all black and white. There are many of these gray shades which we need to understand as researchers. So, no, don't just think that, he's got all the capability, he's got multiple things. The revisit time is so good, and therefore, you are under surveillance. How do you counter it? A simple example I'll tell you. A carrier. How do you recognize a carrier? You recognize the complete carrier group because there are protective forces around it. It's filling in a particular direction. With the SAR radars, you are able to make out the contour. The synthetic aperture radar or an ISAR is able to today define the contour of a carrier, which is how they can make out. So what are the counters? If you do not have a carrier battle group like the Americans, the counter is simple. The carrier does not operate in a carrier battle group. It merges with the sea lines of communication. It disguises itself. All this have been tried out. I'm not talking in air. We tried this out to reconfigure them, camouflage them, hide them from the view of the satellites, because the fact that your 24/7 surveillance is something that is accepted and put into the picture of our planning. Not that you are insulated. You are better prepared because you know what the adversary is doing. So these are some of the factors that I want you to remember before you start asking the questions to them. Because it's not that China has conquered the space world and everything is hunky-dory. They have their own issues. Particularly the one which was related to what he brought out. It's not that the Americans perhaps did not know that we are working on Pokhran. But the information overload, the information system, it happened even in 9/11. They said there was enough information. But the analysis was so skewed, nobody was willing to say that this is something that's likely to happen. There was enough intelligence. It's all been analyzed. So so when we are looking at this, I'm very happy that today we are looking at this as part of our S&T vertical, and you could not have found better people than the three who are here on the stage to tell you, and particularly the model that Professor Ramani tells you that today it can be done. All of you are IT savvy. So this can be done, integrated, given. So I'm happy that he shared it with Integ, and Integ has given them the feedback which are required, both positive and negative. So with this, I thought I'll make some observations as somebody who's been in the Navy for 34 years, and to try and get the whole correct perspective right in terms of what are the challenges that we are facing from the skies above, and how are we going to prepare. Obviously, the first and primary requirement is to invest in equal number of satellites. Without satellites, who are you looking at? How are you looking at them? What are your counters? So there are many questions there. So with this, I'm not going to sum up the whole thing, which is towards the end, but I thought I'll allow a little more time for the youngsters to ask your questions. So the house is open. We have another 25 minutes or so. So the first choice is for all the youngsters. Only when they exhaust their questions will we open it out to the other veterans warrior. Thank you.
Good afternoon, sir. Myself Nitin Prabhu. I am from Department of Defense and Strategic Studies, University of Madras. So my question is to Professor S. Chandrashekar, sir. Sir, my question is, is regarding space debris handling. When it comes, especially in China, why China is showing, behaving like an irresponsible attitude when it comes to handling the space debris? Because we had seen China recently, they have for the past 2-3 years they have sent, they want to create their own space station, Tiangong 1. For that, they have sent Long March, but they didn't. They didn't properly concentrate on this handling their space debris. Recently, July, August month, a 21 ton of like their core stage of their the rocket booster. It actually uncontrollably re-entered into the atmosphere, and it fell on this our Indian Ocean region. So, what's your opinion on this, and how we can avoid these things? And my next question is, we are now the world community is like we are looking for improving, developing our satellites. We're sending our satellites into space. At the same time, there are a lot of satellites that are their lifespan already got over, but still it's revolving in the orbit, and we didn't take much efforts to address this issue. What can be done in future? If we there is, and also I read something about Kessler syndrome. If something like that, if it happened, it would pose a serious threat to entire the satellite arrangements of other countries too. How we can avoid these things?
A lot of questions. Okay, it's kind of difficult to answer all of them. Okay, so I'll try to give you a brief perspective. Okay, there's a lot of talk about China, right? And the main there were two incidents. I think one was the re-entry of a booster stage of the CZ5 vehicle, and the other was the problem of the re-entry of the Tiangong 1, right, which came up and created a big scare. Now this is not new. Okay. So let me go back. This goes back in time to a long history of earlier problems that have been created by both the superpowers, which they choose to downplay now, and which some of them will also have even in the coming future. So one, of course, is to single out China as to say that one of the, and let's not forget, India too has created some debris about which you don't know because they don't talk about it. Okay. So debris is a kind of requirement that comes out of every person who is venturing into space. Because every time you deploy a satellite, something or the other is going to go out. So that's the reality. Okay. Now coming back to this debris issue, I don't know whether any of you know a little bit of space history. I think about maybe 1980s. Okay, I still remember very vividly. Okay, there was this Cosmos Skylab. I'll come back. There's another version of Skylab which I have to tell you. Cosmos 954 was a Soviet satellite. It was an ocean reconnaissance satellite doing exactly the kind of function that I was talking about. It had a nuclear reactor, active nuclear reactor. Okay. It got out, it lost, it had some problem and it went out of control. It crash landed over Canada and spread debris over a 2,000 kilometer area. Radioactive debris. Okay, now this is well documented. I happened to represent India at the UN at that time. It came up for negotiations both in the Outer Space Committee, all kinds of negotiations happened, but Canada and the Soviet Union finally settled it out of court, which is what they should have done in the first place. So there was this debate about debris and all that. The Americans were very neutral. They never talked directly against the Soviet Union. So all the American satellites like UK and all that, they kept on raising this issue. It became a political issue rather than that. That's one kind of, so it's been around ever since. What has significantly changed now is the fact that the scale of operations has gone up. The huge numbers have gone up. And for the first time in recorded history, I think two satellites collided, a dead Cosmos satellite and an Iridium satellite collided, and it created a lot of debris. Now, this is debris apart from the fact that there are a number of rocket stages, upper stages especially, that have left residual propellant. They have also exploded. And if a collision happens between two satellites like Cosmos and all, it creates its own field of debris. Or if a kinetic weapon test like the Chinese did in 2007 at a high altitude, that will also create a debris. So there's a whole string of requirements for debris. The problem with debris and getting it back is the fact that in order to do that, you need to put something very expensive into space, and debris is distributed all over, so it has to do a lot of maneuvers occur. So it's going to be very expensive in order to remove all of that. So the standard solution people do is, in order to eliminate it, for example, in geostationary orbit, at the time when the satellite is going to die, right, you have a little bit of propellant and you kick it into something called a graveyard orbit. Okay, so that's the kind of standard thing that you're going. But let me reassure you. So there are going to be many more incidents like the Chinese incident. And now I think China will try to make sure that those incidents don't happen. All of us do it. Once it happens, we will try not to do it. So I think that part is going to, but it will happen. Because these are complex systems, and certainly you will have problems of re-entry. And I'm not sure whether some major disaster will happen or not. If it hits a big city, for example, a big piece, it's going to create a major problem. These things will happen. And I don't know whether anything can be done in order to avoid that, unless there is an international agreement. Okay. Now, all international agreements that we are talking about have been stymied simply because everybody knows what has to be done, but nobody wants to do it. Why? Simply because I have an advantage, I don't want the other person to have the advantage. So let me repeat, international law is about a ratification of a power structure. And as long as there are competing power structures, that ratification will not happen. Let me give you an example. The Outer Space Treaty and the Partial Test Ban Treaty was negotiated when there were two powers, right? One was the Soviet Union, one was US. Other countries didn't have any stake. Okay. So what did they do? For example, the nuclear treaty, right? They had atmospheric tests. Lot of people had problems because of radioactive debris coming out of those atmospheric tests. It created a major health issue. Okay. Then they had an underwater test. They did a nuclear test underwater off an atoll called Johnston Atoll or Johnston Island. They destroyed half the island. Okay. They did a test in space. I think it was called Starfish or something like that, some megaton test. Some 15-20 satellites got destroyed. So the Soviet Union and the US felt, right, that this is bad for both of us. Let's get together and we will have an international treaty. So I'm coming back. Partial Test Ban Treaty and the Outer Space Treaty, which bans all these nuclear tests, came about because these two powers agreed. And once they agreed, right, they forced all the other countries to agree. And what does it mean? So ASAT treaty, for example, if an ASAT treaty is signed, India cannot do an ASAT test. Right? So when they did the, when they did the NPT, right, India had not tested. So obviously, we had a problem. So the point about treaties, therefore, it's about ratification of power structures and legalizing them so that other countries don't have access to the same kinds of things that we have done, right? So it's really about, so it's all about power relations. Treaties are all about marginal exceptions like Antarctic Treaty. We'll talk a little bit about that if required. So this is really the way the world works. So we are looking at power structure. So I do not believe that China and the US are ever going to agree, at least not in the next 10 years, because they are looking, and the Americans believe that they are at a significant advantage. And they do not want the space area to be dominated or even partially dominated. So this competition is going to intensify. We're going to have more problems, right? Some of it will be controlled with improved practices, but I don't see an agreement which limits anything. This is how I see it. So the debris will continue, it will increase, many satellites will get damaged. All these are predictable. Can you do something? There are technical choices that you can do. They are expensive. Will they be implemented? Maybe, maybe not.
Good afternoon, sir. Sir, my questions are very in general, so it is not pointed to anyone in particular. So my first question is, as the need of satellites are very much increasing, so there is a need for ISRO working in a commercial part and for military purposes. So is India taking any steps towards this? Like dividing ISRO like for separate for commercial part and dedicating another part to the militarization. So that is my question. I hope you got the question, sir. And my second question is, we have seen our adversaries like China, which are building their own space commands. For example, they have strategic space command dedicated for space. So, is there any need for India also to have a dedicated space command, as all the armed forces are very much dependent on the satellites? And my third question is, we spoke about the ASAT satellite, like ASAT technology to destroy any satellite. But do India have a capability to secure our satellites? Like basically, I feel it comes under the ballistic missile defense. Whether are we capable of securing our own satellites? Thank you, sir.
So let me answer the last question first. In order to defend a satellite against an ASAT test, you need to have a very smart satellite. You need to build a lot of maneuvering capability and all that. You need to be able to send something. So it requires a lot of new development. I would argue that the Americans are already far ahead in doing most of it. So they are looking at it seriously. The moment you do all this, it means you're going to complicate your satellite a lot, because it has to be able to detect everything around it. It has to find out whether something is threatening or not threatening, and then it has to take some. This is one kind of thing. So maneuver is one of the easiest ways in which you can avoid something coming to. That is definitely a possibility. But so the second question that you talked about is ISRO and what it can do. My point would be that the number of satellites that India requires, I don't know whether there is an assessment at a national level where we look at an integrated picture of even in transponders, civilian communication transponders, I think more than 2/3 of the transponders we use in India for television are foreign transponders. We don't have that much capacity. So clearly there is a need even to build domestic capacity for commercial needs. So the industry role in the development of the space program should become an industrial program of the country, not an ISRO program for the country. You understand the difference? ISRO should now move away from a lot of the work that it does internally to creating a space industry. My boss, Professor Dhawan, when I used to work for him, that is what he wanted. He wanted India to become industrially a space, not ISRO as a space. So I think the response to that, if you want to scale up, want to propagate this, you need to make a massive investment with government support to industry. Not telling industry, here's an opportunity, come and bid. But say we will buy 20 satellites of this kind if you are willing to provide them. Please provide them. We will pay you this kind of money. These kinds of contracts can be worked out. We've done some of it in ISRO in the earlier days. It can be done. So we need a government kind of initiative where the industry is encouraged and motivated to make the investment so that they can produce. This has been talked about for the last 20 years, ever since I left ISRO. It is still talk. ISRO is a monopoly which makes policy, which makes builds satellites, builds rockets. It doesn't want industry to grow in the country, is my view. We need to change that. Who's changing it? No, nobody's changing it. We don't understand what has to be done, or if you understand, we don't want to do it. So industry, in my opinion, is a major requirement, even for the civilian. I think the country is now clear. The Defense Space Agency has been set up. So the civilian part and the military part apparently are like, I would argue there is a lot of economies to be derived if you can put them together. The same satellite bus can do the civilian part to the military part. There is some need to coordinate whether they should be separate or so that's a political decision. I don't know the current thinking. But there is some sense to trying to make sure that we have an integrated view so that even the industrial part can be taken care of. A lot of defense satellites can also be built in industry. I mean, all the stuff that I talked, L&T or a consortium of companies can build 20 satellites in maybe 2 years. It can be done. So the point I'm arguing is I think we need a national look, right? And right now I don't see that national look. So we have pieces, like everything else, we have pieces that are there. But I would argue that we need to make first, and we need to recognize there is a requirement. Of course, one solution is to tie up with the Americans and say they will give up. I think it's a risky path from my own experience. But maybe that's the path forward. I have no idea. Maybe that's how the future. But this is something that you need to.
Here. Okay. Not answer. Okay. So my question is, can you please share your brief insight on China's hypersonic programs?
I am not an expert, but I think we have some people. Ramani has worked on it, so maybe he is the right guy to talk about it. I think there is hypersonic missiles are going to see. Let me repeat: when a ballistic missile re-enters the atmosphere, it is already at hypersonic speed. It comes into the air of the atmosphere. It's already traveling at. So one of the problems in ballistic missile defense, for example, is the fact that it's very difficult to predict. You can do a few things in order to make it move. So it's very difficult to deal with a very fast moving. And if there are several of them coming back at the same time, the defenses are, it's, all this BMD stuff there. So even ballistic missile defense, for example, is complicated. Not going to work, right? As well as people say, although we assume that it's going to. This is one part. The hypersonic is different in the sense that it doesn't come from space. In the sense it comes from a regular missile going up. At some stage in the missile's thing, kind of goes above the atmosphere, because to do it at the atmospheric level, then it is able to maneuver at hypersonic. And it can do a number of these alternative trajectories. Again, it complicates the thing. Now, the difference between a hypersonic trajectory and a ballistic missile trajectory is the time. Hypersonic may be much shorter. Typical ICBM, for example, you have half an hour. Hypersonic missile over a shorter range, it may be the order of a few. So it complicates the defense. Now the Chinese are doing something, the Americans are doing something, Russians are doing something. I'm sure India is also doing something. And I think all of them are going to get into the operation. And I would argue that it is going to be a very destabilizing. In the sense we already have a complicated situation, likely to be. But are the countries of the world going to agree? My argument is the US may think it's ahead, the Chinese may think US is behind, or we are ahead. So everybody is competing for what I call being the first to be. So at some stage when everybody feels they have enough, maybe they will. As I see it in the entire domain of all this integrated information law that I talked about, I see no easy separation and identifying parts of it. Everybody will have to look. My point is, it is a reality, it will become a reality. He did some trajectory work for hypersonics. Yeah. No, I think stealth is going to be a part of all of them. I think there will be ways to counter it. These are all givens. The point is, we should assume that all these things, then worry about what. Salt 2 is gone long ago, sir. Start 3 is also. I see, the nuclear thing, in my opinion, is more like, see, the Chinese approach to nuclear is interesting. They bring in what is called strategic ambiguity. So the DF-21 missile has got a military component, like a ASPM, has got a nuclear component, where a nuclear weapon is there. The two missiles to a radar is going to look pretty, right? Now the Chinese have brought in, so there are two ways of deterring. One is the American way, which says, if you do something to me, I will destroy you. I'm showing you all the things that I can do. You do the tests, you do some interception, you do an ASAT test, or you destroy something in space. So you are establishing credibility of by the fact that you are actually demonstrating that I can take you out. In other words, it's hard indication of intention and capability that they are doing as a part of the game. So don't mess with us, we can do this to you. Chinese are smarter. They don't have such a big nuclear arsenal. They are not interested in looking at the whole world and destroying all of it. They just want to deter nuclear attack. Their strategy is to confuse. So my point is, if you introduce an element of risk into a Taiwan crisis, saying the DF-21 that I'm going to use in the crisis, because of all the AI and all the stuff and the complex network that you're doing, there is a faint probability that this missile, that is a civilian or a conventional warhead, can be mistaken for a nuclear warhead, and you might respond in kind. So it's a risk you have to take. So they're putting the onus on the Americans to say, please take the risk. You want to go to an escalation of a Taiwan crisis to a nuclear risk, you take that. So they are bringing in intentional strategic ambiguity to this equation. So their approach to deterrence is slightly different. So you have to factor in. But my argument is it's all game playing. I don't think both the Chinese and the Americans will go to nuclear escalation. But as I said, in the escalation possibilities, you cannot rule it out. I think both countries are pretty sensible. Nuclear war is highly unlikely. Huh? Ooh, Chinese. Chinese have one for a long time, 1981 or so. All nuclear, all nuclear, all nuclear.
Sir, I have a question.
All nuclear, all of them are there. Yeah, please.
Hello, sir. My name is Shanmita, and I'm coming from the Department of International Studies from Women's Christian College. So this is a question out of curiosity. Even though your software is at its nascent stage, how long did it take to develop this software?
You should ask Dr. Ramani.
Yes, sir.
Yes, project that we had with Boeing. Boeing had extensive simulation capability. What they lacked, an orbital prediction model. We all know that an orbital model can be constructed provided the initial orbital position is given at a certain epoch. So they approached us. They couldn't do it. They approached ISSP at NIAS. One of our engineers who was coordinating with them was able to get the NORAD element by looking at the database. And that's what he gave for the number of satellites they needed. I came in at that time and said, I'm a lazy man. I can't sit down and write the piece of paper, but I prefer to write a program for getting it from the NORAD data. That took much longer. I will come to the finally answering the question of how long did it take. You should also appreciate I am a pretty old person. So as a result, my knowledge also is centered around Fortran, one of the archaic languages. So if you are doing it today, for example, I can answer that way. We have learned a lot of things in the past. Maybe at some points in time, we needed a lot of help. So, but now possibly if somebody is willing to do this in a language like C++, and a core level code for fetching the information from the NORAD database can be in Python. It can be done fairly the entire trajectory can be computed in less than 6 months. The GUI is over and above that. This is a fairly well-known one. We took a lot of burden on us in terms of the old language was being used, which is Fortran, which is not ANSI compatible at that time. So as a result, many restrictions came on the computing program before it drives the GUI. So the GUI program cannot accept from a Fortran a single element. It has to be only a string elements and things like this. These are the kind of unrealistic limitations on the handshake part of it. Without any of those, if you move into modern languages, it's possible in 6 months. You still, how long did it take? And by doing this, I have become old.
Thank you for answering, sir.
What is the exact question? Computing
And one of the reasons I hesitated to get into the Indian thing at all. See, first, I don't think I'm competent. I'm good at the strategic part. I'm not sure I understand the tactical part. I really don't have enough knowledge about the tactical aspect of war fighting. I have to confess I'm totally ignorant. You have in C3S a very august body who know much more than I will ever do about that part. So I never have done any work because I see a lot of sensitivities in the Indian thing. For example, NIAS is a kind of think tank, but I can't afford to go out and say that India is doing this or not doing it. I would argue there is a limitation which we put on ourselves. That is one part. The second part I would argue is that we are. I would argue. I mean, the only thing I did was to do something on space because I felt that when I did the China study, I felt everybody would ask about what India should do. That's why I went and did that part. So I generally don't worry too much about what India does. I don't worry about India's national security, really. And I think that's largely one of the reasons I think the program we have evolved is more to look at the neighborhood and what kinds of challenges it poses for them. And so this is one of the reasons why I think I am not in a position where I can clearly answer your question. And I'm certainly not privy to the secrets of the government of India to give you this authoritative discourse of what India is doing or not doing. I don't know. So that's really the answer there.
Sir, and I have another question for Professor and Ram. Sir, how robust is this satellite simulation software? Is there any possibilities for a cyber manipulation?
Sorry.
See, as we said, this is useful for many defense organizations. So they don't want to get connected to internet. That itself gives a lot of immunity towards a cyber attack. Cyber attack in the other forms, where, for example, supply chain management, etc., is independent of connectivity to internet. That everybody should take care, right? Given that, there is no possibility that this software can be attacked by, it doesn't have a extra threat as long as the minimal adherence is, for example, if you, in the name of, it's not such a crucial thing, first of all, for somebody to come and attack in the cyber thing, okay? Given that if somebody is determined to do it just for a demonstration, well, you try your best, if you can't, let it go. So that's all. See, but to come to the serious thing, was there another part of your question other than cyber attacks? So what I can say is, I thought first, right, the way I understood to begin with, how did you know that your program is doing the right thing? So that's what I thought you were going to ask. See, there are a number of test cases which are published by NORAD itself for a certain number of NORAD given elements from this time to this time. You can compute it and compare with that, right? These are machine readable files. You can even make a comparison machine logic wise. You don't need to sit and check someone reading, someone else checking, etc. So this process can be made automatic. So that is as far as the trajectory is concerned. The rest of the things, I depend on solely Chandra. So what he is one of our major users. So whenever he does, I can recall many cases where what do? We take some algorithms for whatever is the thing. For example, this is all, what happens is, intersection of polygons is what it ultimately comes to. These are very standard formulations are available. You code them and the test cases are there. But when you integrate, there can be problem. But let me add more to that. When we used to be in ISRO, when we were really developing software for critical applications, it was never done by a small group of people. We had including inversion programming, that is, two groups will do the same problem using different approaches, that means different coding techniques, right? So as another thing, they are not going to exactly match for various reasons. But qualitatively they match, and analytically one can have, at least you end up giving credentials to them in the sense which is number one, which is number two, right? So we order them by saying that this is what, as long as it gives the result, this will be number one. If it has any convergence problems and it is unable to produce a result, then you fall back onto the second software. That means we have, first of all, we need a result. If you get results by more than one way, you have a priority as to which is number one, which is number two. That's the way the inversion program. Now, not only that. So, for example, if the software is working and some modification is necessary or some bug is identified, you have to make through the code changes have to be performed. This code changes can fix this bug, it can introduce bug elsewhere. So this is a very tricky situation where generally these days you have the so-called IDEs, interactive development environments, which can even generate the test cases based on the coverage that you need to do. And more over and above all this, review is the only process by which it can be done. More than one mind should come in. We are not talking about such a critical application. So I thought your first question was, how do you prove the program right? So is it? Yeah, cyber ambiguity.
My questions to Professor Chandrashekar.
Sir, my question is to Professor Ramurthy. Sir, can you give more insights on the business incubation model in China for the science and technology field?
The business incubation model is a well-known model, extensively used in United States. Is it okay? Yeah. What they do is, you have an institution, a setup, which gives the basic facilities. You have an idea, you go to them, they first screen whether the idea is workable, can it be implemented. Then they give you basic support to actually implement it and show that it works. And then they give you some infrastructural support so that it gets started. Once it is picking up, you go out and the next person comes in. This is a well-known model. Even India has it, but they have many more such. So, lot more students will have an opportunity to try out their idea. So, you see, even if you just see internet, many of the small things are all originating in China because of this. Because you can try something, if it fails, you go. I always say, in the United States, I have an idea, I take money from one of these institutions, it fails, and I will fill it in my CV that I had an idea and failed, and I am ready for the next idea. In India, I have an idea, I fail, even my wife will not cook for the next meal. That is a cultural difference. China has gone on to the US model. You are welcome to fail, but try.
My questions to Professor S. Chandrashekar. Sir, I want to ask you about India's space program with regards China's space program. So, China, Long March 5 and all these rockets, they've been able to, venture out into the heavy class, although not super heavy traditionally, but heavy class they're able to venture into. What's stopping us at only taking to 4 tons to geosynchronous transfer orbit? And where is the lacuna? That is, we have a cryogenic engine, but there's a lot of talk about semi-cryo, etc. Where is the lacuna? Where did it start? Do you think that ISRO spy case or something had something to do with it, or is that just...
So, first let me...
Yeah, I watched the film, but no, that's not part of what I'm asking. I'm asking this because... Yeah.
Yeah, let me answer the first question. I want to say the ISRO spy scandal had nothing to do with what happened. Okay. The spy scandal is a reality,
yes,
but rocketry depicts that reality not necessarily in the real world that it happened.
Right.
I can speak with authority because I was one of the people who actually wrote a letter along with Professor Dhawan in support of Nambi and why he needed to be defended. So there is a lot of issues behind the spy scandal, but rocketry depicts them in a very different light. So first is forget about the rocketry part. The spy scandal, the cryo spy scandal is true.
Yeah.
A lot of it is just created. And a lot of it is not external, as everybody makes it out. It's not the CIA, it's not the State Department. ISRO knew very well when they signed the cryogenic deal that the Americans were going to sanction us. One of the reasons why I left ISRO was because I said we should not do this without understanding the implications. So I left ISRO because of that. So my point again is, it is not as though people who took the decision to get the Russian cryo did not know the consequences and what the Americans would do. They were very clear that they were going to follow the law, and the law was very clear that whether the president wanted it or not, sanctions would be imposed on ISRO. So that's the reality. So the American hand and all that stuff that is projected in a lot of stories and all that is absolutely untrue. Okay? There is absolutely no basis in reality or fact. Nambi had a serious problem because he was a victim, and he went to jail, he suffered a lot, and he's come out of it with flying colors. So what happened to him and all those problems associated with it are genuine problems. But all the other stuff that went into it about the cryo, about who did it, who didn't do it, a lot of it is, I think, creative cinematic license. We should give that part to the but please don't believe a lot of that part. Yeah. But what happened to Nambi and all that is genuine, and I think it reflects more on the internal systems we have in place for the governance of some of the critical areas in our. I don't think that lesson has percolated even now, so we still may be somewhat similar in a lot of it. So one is, it was injustice that happened to, I would argue that Nambi was one of several hundreds of scientists who contributed to this. All of us did it, but so the point is, he had this particular problem, and because of that, I would argue that what happened to him shouldn't happen to anybody else. That is one part. The second part you wanted to know was what, please?
So with regards heavy lift capability, we are stuck
you
at
wanted
4 tons.
about the launch capability. Yeah. Why is it? Yeah. I would argue that signing the cryogenic engine deal set back the Indian program in a significant way. Now, why am I saying that? Let me argue that. My argument is, if the Russian technology had come, so let me give you the earlier example of the technology import. We got the Vikas engine technology from the French, which actually powered the PSLV. I was directly involved in ISRO when all this was happening. Okay, so I'm talking with a reasonable amount of knowledge. It takes about, I would argue, 7 to 8 years to take the technology and to be able to actually convert it into an industrial case. It requires a lot of investment. Okay? And we can certainly produce an engine. But a liquid rocket engine is much more than just the production part. You also have to know a little bit about the design, about the thinking behind it. It's a highly complex, interconnected system. Everything affects everything. So you need a lot of what I call knowledge generated by actually doing things. So only when you build and launch them and understand them properly can you really, right? So when Professor Dhawan left ISRO in 1984, he had already thought about the next step, which is to go from PSLV to the geosynchronous launch vehicle, which is powered by the cryogenic engine. He wanted one engine, cryogenic engine. So we had identified the cryo upper stage as critical. I think it was the right choice at that time. And he said, we will do that. Professor Dhawan had understood MTCR. He understood what the Americans would do. He had come to the conclusion that we must do it internally, in the country. And he said, we will do one cryogenic stage, which will be added to the PSLV modules, right, in order to go into the, to the GSM. Okay? So this was the plan. He retired in 1984. Now, successive chairman after that went back, and legitimately so, to relook at it. So there was also this strong lobby inside ISRO which wanted an import, because they had done the Vikas import, and it had fired the PSLV second stage. So Nambi, for example, was a part of that group which wanted the import. So what happened is, so like all people, we wanted to examine whether people would sell it. Right? The Americans, so we went to GE, US State Department. So we went to the Americans and asked them whether they would sell us. Now the Americans have a very good Atlas Center upper stage, fantastic cryogenic engine. If they would give it to us, nothing like it. And we could actually do the JSLV and kind of jump ahead of the curve that we were looking at. Unfortunately, the Americans have had serious problems always with the missile part of ISRO. They don't have so much problems with satellite part.
So, but cryogenics aren't used in missile, right?
Let me come back. So the MTCR, right, which is what I'm talking about, does not separate out what is cryo, what is not. They have a requirement. What is that requirement? Any satellite, any rocket stage any rocket stage that can take a 500 kilogram payload beyond the range of 300 kilometers is subject to MTCR sanctions. MTCR became a law in the United States. Okay, and if you violated the law, the Congress would sanction that particular entity. So that was the case. So then what happened? Because of all this, right? We could. The Americans said no. The other country that had the stage was Japan. So we went to Japan. Japan didn't even look at us. I think they are more American than the Americans. Okay, they didn't even look at us. I mean, I'm talking because I knew all this. I was there. Okay. And then the third option was to go to the French. They had an upper stage for the Ariane, which was doing very well. So when we went to the French, they said in those days they wanted a price of $2 billion. And they put all kinds of conditions on what you can do with that stage. Okay. We didn't have that money. I don't think the government is going to give us that kind of money. So we had to say no. So we went back to the indigenous option, and we had actually got the project cleared for an indigenous cryo with a GSLV with an indigenous cryo. It had been approved at the cabinet, and we were going to go ahead. I'm talking about 1991. So between 84 and 91, we went through all these stages. But I think we should have gone ahead and moved on the cryo on ourselves. So this was one part. We did make some investments, but maybe not enough. So that was one part. So when we went to when all this was happening, the Russians suddenly came up and said, we have this cryo stage. Now let me repeat, the cryo stage that the Russians had is a fantastic stage. Very good. Very good. But there are two problems with it, right? Now, as we were talking during the 7-year period, what is happening to the requirement? The communication satellites have been growing in size. So the GSLV has to deliver a communication satellite which has to be built in the future, because it's going to take 5 to 8 years to build, and therefore you have to project what the satellite weight is going to be in the next 7 to 8 years. So we were doing that exercise, but unfortunately the Russian cryo, even with all the things that it promised, was going to fall a little short. Okay. But then ISRO took the view, I mean internally it was one of the views, that we would go ahead and sign it because it was a very good deal. For 250 crores, which promised, they said we will give you everything. And then we went ahead and signed the deal. So the moment we signed the deal, the Americans caught on. Right? They had a deal going $2 billion worth of exchanges between Russia and the United States. They turned the screws on the Russians, and within a year they had to renege on the contract. Now what happened to ISRO? We have to do the Russian stage. We have, for political reasons, we have to go with the Russians. So we had the Russian stage. 7 of them came to us. We put them on different components and do some launching. So that's one project. The second project was to reverse engineer what the Russians had given with Indian industry. That's the second project. And the third project was, as it was going on, we need a higher weight for the satellite. We need to do a third indigenous cryo development. So instead of doing one project, which is what I think we would have taken longer a little bit, maybe spent a little bit more money, but then we ended up by doing 3 projects, which took even longer. At the end of it, we didn't even get the capability. So the cryogenic engine and its development has delayed ISRO significantly. So one of the reasons why we are only at 6 tons, the Chinese are at, but even low Earth orbit, assuming GTO, low Earth orbit, you just launch at whatever you want, we are looking at 5 tons, 5, 6. So the point I'm making is everybody else, the Chinese have gone far, about 25 tons is, I think, CZ5. If you're looking at US, Elon Musk is sending a Tesla car to Mars, and he's building a bigger rocket. So everywhere, I think the Americans have 3 or 4 big rockets. The Europeans have at least 1. The Chinese have CZ5, which is big. Everywhere else, they are far ahead. Okay, so we are still behind. Now we have to do, the next step we have to do is to build a bigger rocket. Have to do that. Whether we have the money, how we will do it, these are all only ISRO can answer. I can only talk from.
Thank you, audience, for asking very pertinent questions, and thank you, panelists, for taking out time and answering all the questions very patiently. This is an announcement to know that we have the discount coupons for the book. Those who wish to purchase the book, kindly contact the organizers. Now, as we have come to the conclusion, I invite Dhanya, Research Officer C3S, to propose a vote of thanks.
Good evening to one and all present here. I am Dhanya, Research Officer at C3S. I thank C3S for giving me this opportunity to propose a vote of thanks. I thank Rear Admiral S. Venkatraman, VSM, Flag Officer Commanding, Tamil Nadu and Puducherry Naval Area, for taking time off his busy schedule and graciously agreeing to release the book today. I thank Professor S. Chandrashekar for giving us the privilege and opportunity to launch his book in Chennai and for the insightful presentation on China's A to AD strategy. I thank Professor V.S. Ramamurthy for his riveting presentation on China's emergence as a global power in S&T and innovation. I would also like to thank Dr. N. Ramani for his presentation on software for missile trajectory and gracing us with his presence. I extend my gratitude to all the veterans from the armed forces, serving officers, foreign delegates, distinguished members of C3S, and friends from the media for joining us in this event. Last but not the least, I thank the students and the audience who have joined us virtually for your participation, interactions, and bringing useful discussion to the table. Finally, I would like to thank Chennai Center for China Studies and Commodore R.S. Vasan for giving us this opportunity. Jai Hind, thank you.